attending, and most of this finance committee meeting, the information will be delivered by our own Mr. Tom Wall. So I welcome everyone, and Tom, if you'd like to go ahead and get us started, I'd appreciate it.
All right, welcome everybody. We have quite a bit on the agenda today, so I'm going to go relatively quick, so feel free to stop me as we go along.
Well, I'm going to stop you real quick one time. We do have a list of anyone that would like to make comments. As of now, I have no comments from the public, but I will keep my eye on that for about another 10 minutes.
All right, I'm going to take over the screen so I can present the slides as we go along. So can everybody see the agenda here?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
All right, so on the agenda, we're mainly going to be talking about the 2020-21 school year. We have several slides we're going to go through. Then we're going to talk briefly. That's going to take up most of the meeting on the time-wise. Then we're going to go to our Moody's credit. As you're aware, the college did a new bond, a non-voter approved bond for energy upgrades. And we had to go through a review by Moody's. So I just want to make sure I cover that briefly with the board. And then Jeff Higgins from Plant Moran is going to come in and just talk briefly on the pre-audit conference. They're required to do that prior to starting the audit. And they are starting the audit next week for some of the preliminary review. And they'll be back in late August, early September for the remaining balance of it. So with that, we're going to jump right in. So the first one is the millage rates. So as part of the audit, we're required to talk about the millage rates that we're going to do for next year. So this is a form you're used to seeing every year. And I'll probably go into more detail for the public when we get to the public hearing on the June 8th meeting as part of the discussion. So we'll talk more about that there. But the primary thing the biggest thing that's changed is the millage rate. So if you look on there on the fourth and fifth line where it says debt in column 2, previously we were levying 4.82 mils. Now we're down to 3.5. And that's because the 2002 bonds are starting to come off the bonds. So we actually reduced that number of bonds, or the bonds that are outstanding for the millage. So we have to collect less money. So and you'll see that actually stay the same for next year. And after that, you'll see another drop. So I just want to make sure you're aware of that change. And we've discussed this a lot during the bond issue that we put on the agenda back in November that just failed 5149. And unfortunately, with all this pandemic issues that are ravishing our community and the state, we have not really gotten back into that. And we've kind of put that on the backside as there's been a lot of issues we had to deal for operational purposes and for the whole look of what's going to be next fall of how school's going to look. But eventually we'll have to get back into that whole discussion and have a long-term plan of how to address the infrastructure of the district. So that was the millage rates, unless people have more questions. Just one other key note that we did have a large increase in our tax base of 4.5%. So that's rather large for 1 year. But most economists are saying that we won't see a decline in the tax base due to the recent state events until next year, because most of the taxing changes had to be submitted to the state well before the state shutdown. So I don't think we'll see much impact this year as much as next year. I think we'll see an impact on the current issues in the state. All right, the next one is the foundation allowance graph. This is the history of our foundation since 1995, which is right after Proposal A went into effect a couple years earlier. I took out the couple earlier years just so the numbers didn't get too small, and I can make it a little bigger. So as you can see, there's been a steady increase until we got to the 2009-10 when the recession hit. And you can see we had a large drop there. That's when we lost that $470 in our foundation allowance. And so we were status quo for zero increase for a couple of years, and then it started to incline. And when we got to 2020, that was the first time we were actually just below where we were or higher than we were before. We're actually just below because 8746. But you can see next year in 2021 that our most likely scenario, we're looking at losing 650 foundation allowance per pupil. That's going to put us all the way back down to the 2002, 2003 funding level. So this was just a way to give you a kind of a visual of the impact that we're expecting to get, that the state economy is going to affect schools for this upcoming year. And again, ask questions as we go along. So looking at that, so one of the things that is large in the agenda that the district has been working on for a couple of years now is a new curriculum adoption for ELA and high school math. And I do have two handouts there for background on it. But I know Dr. Chokol is on the line. So why don't Jill just give a quick 1-minute recap of the process so the board understands that and where we're going from here.
So the curriculum process for the district by teachers, as we all know, and about 2 years ago, both the elementary language arts and the high school put forth piloting process that each separately piloted, and then the pilots resulted in recommendation. So it is the recommendation of an language arts curriculum and writing, as well as math curriculum, and includes some 8th grade advanced math. So the process follows the curriculum guidelines under the board policies for curriculum, and the principal groups, instructional cabinet, and curriculum council have all supported.
So this adoption for the ELA is roughly about 1.5 million. And the high school math is about 700,000. I'm just rounding for numbers for easier to say. And that we'll be paying over the first 2 years, and it crosses 2 fiscal years, and at no interest. And normally, this would come out of the general fund, but the nice thing is with this federal money, as one of the webinars we had, I was able to ask them the question specifically, the state of Michigan, can we include new curriculum on the CARES Act, the federal funding? And the answer was yes, especially since it has a strong online component where we have a letter of understanding with the vendors involved that about 75% of the cost is for online materials. So it was nice to see that we could actually move that money off of the general fund and into the CARES Act as part of that money.
The other part is also that this covers all of the consumable materials over a period of 6 years. So although the payment is over a 2-year period, all of the student workbooks and that sort are for an entire cost cover.
So with questions for you.
Yep, go right ahead.
So this is saying then that we'd be paying for this over a 2 or 3 year period then, though it's going to be good for 6?
They gave us the option to pay it over 2 years. We can pay it all in the first year, but they did give the option over 2 years.
Okay, so we could use the CARES Act money now. We don't have to worry about it going more than 1 year if we choose to do a one lump sum payment.
Correct.
And do we pay anything for the existing material that we're using?
Right now, for elementary language arts, we do not have a good. So right now, elementary teaching what we call mentor tech cloud books, and they assign all of their own lessons under the daily. So Day 5 has been around in about 2010. That was the result of our last budget, our severe budget crisis. It's a management system. It involves readers workshop and writers workshop. So we a lot of teachers, but it is a lot of work for our teachers to collect all of the lessons and all of the books, and it's heavily teacher dependent, meaning that it does not provide digital resources. So when we shut down in March, the teachers who were piloting the programs actually had a huge advantage. About 31 piloting programs because they had all these digital resources the other teachers have. So we knew that this was, a very challenging time to recommend such a large purchase. And so we have talked to the teachers and the administrators extensively about how these would support the instruction of students if indeed we had to provide any instruction remotely. And of course, in person, all of the resources are hands-on and books in the hands of kids.
Thank you.
All right, with that, then it's a nice lead into the Federal CARES Act funding.
One question about the interest first. You said 50%, so is the other 50% with interest for the next year?
Nope, nope, it's 50-50 with no interest payment on either one. And that's something we negotiated with them just because we weren't sure, because we started this process a while back, and we were trying to see how we could make sure it didn't impact the general fund too heavily, not knowing that the CARES Act was coming. That we would negotiate that to help ease that we could actually pay it over 2 years for the 6-year span versus all in 1 year. So that's something we negotiated, and it is at no interest.
And with the teachers, and this is not related to finance, much of more of the question to Dr. Chokol, as far as the teachers having the freedom to select things that are not on this curriculum.
So the feedback from the piloting team, well, actually from all the teachers, that they want a one. We have students change schools at both at elementary and across high school. Having standard. And two, same for the high school. They not have a standard is up to effort level of the of that all together. Our teachers talent and on development, all of the lessons, hence the selection piloting year-long pilot that they.
Okay, well, by that the teachers are finding it useful and not being like restrictive to, because there are a lot of teachers who feel like they want to make their own curriculum, which is a huge undertaking, but hopefully they can find that balance.
I have another question for Dr. Chokol on that line. If the board went ahead with these new curriculums, I assume that there would be training over the summer for all the teachers. If the training has to happen virtually, do we think that's going to be more difficult for these teachers to be ready to roll with it once we get back in the fall?
That's a great question. And I have to say that I just spent 90 minutes in what is called Benchmark Universe. Benchmark is language arts curriculum, and all of the, as part of the pilot, let me back up a little, piloting process. What we always do is materials, and we held a session for administrators. And so we 90 minutes online today, having each walk everyone who participated, 159 teachers who participated. The parent one was still going on when this meeting started, so I don't know how many parents clicked in. But the goal was to allow everyone to look at the materials, to examine them, and of course, all of this was done virtually. So both companies provide their professional development and training virtually, and pending board approval, we actually could be providing some training for teachers in the month of June. Because when something new comes along, our teachers want some time. They want to use some of their summer time to get used to the new curriculum resource, as well as providing time in August. We've planned for it to be virtual. It may end up being something different, but we felt that a plan for virtual training would be safest.
Okay.
Okay, so we move on to the CARES Act planning. And so we were notified, obviously, from the state a couple of weeks ago that the CARES Act funding was allocated on the Title I distribution. So our district is entitled to roughly about 8.5 million, just under 8.5 million. And we have to share that on a per student basis with non-public schools that are registered and certified at the state level. So using that formula, we have 20,635 in the fall count. We had 2,500 non-public schools. So we take that and divide it by, on an equitable basis per child, that non-public schools in our area are eligible for $917,000 in change. The district, 7.5 million. And so those numbers is what we use as a budget. And we looked at and had a planning meeting and looked at how we spend this funding. We won't go through all these, but just kind of show you all the different categories. I broke it down by instructional resources, support resources, and operational side, as well as transfers out. And majority of that obviously will be the non-public schools. But at the very top of on the instructional side, you'll see the language arts and the math resources, lines 6 and 9. You can see the total cost there, that majority of the cost will be paid by the CARES Act. So roughly about a little over 1.6 million of it will be paid by the CARES Act, and the remaining balance will be paid by the general fund. And we used a 75% allocation because that's the number we received from the vendors for the online material portion. And therefore, the other balance would be paid by the general fund, which is within our allocation that we normally allocate for curriculum materials every year. So just kind of giving you an example of how we're going to use it. We are not obviously finished developing this altogether. You'll see things highlighted in yellow that we still have to kind of work through some of the nuances. And it's kind of similar to what we do with Title I, that eventually we have to get into line item detail to submit it to the state for approval. There has been several sessions at the state level working with the department that's overseeing this to help us work through some of the issues. But everything on the list so far, I believe, is eligible for the CARES Act. And the federal government even made the state understand their state is not supposed to further define the uses. They have to stay with the federal expectations of use of funds. So we don't see a lot of issues on things that we have in here saying that the state wants to kind of reduce or funnel more expenditures into certain type of expenditures. They're not allowed to do that. You'll see a whole lot of different things in here that have to be COVID-19 related. And there is no supplement versus supplant like there is in Title I. That if we do certain things with the general fund money and we can't decide to do partially general fund and partially Title I, there's that supplement. This is Title I is supposed to supplement the general fund program. But on this case, for the CARES Act, we can supplement. So we can take some of our salaries that we normally would have had only in the general fund and use some of the CARES Act to offset that. So you'll see in here that we'll actually offset nurses. For example, we have some general fund nurses that aren't assigned to special ed 100%. So some of those costs will be able to go underneath the CARES Act. Social workers, a percentage of their salaries can go to this. Counselors, psychologists, things that are going to be impacted by COVID-19. For example, there's several departments like my department, part of the accounting staff percentage of their salaries can be used because there's going to be reporting as required in any federal money. And things like that are going to show up in here. For example, some of the operational costs, I'll scroll down to that. some of the operational costs when we had to clean Whitmore Bowls back on March 12th and 13th. That was a 1-day cleaning that we had to do before the state shut us down. And so we're going to look at trying to get reimbursed for that cost. Obviously, the going forward, all the personal protective equipment that we're trying to now inventory and stockpile for the start of school, depending on what kind of model we have. We have already started trying to gather an inventory for that to make sure we're prepared for that. That will be in here. Hand washing stations, things like that are now going to be part of, the whole CARES Act. And so this is kind of a working list as we work through it. If you look at the very bottom, we've allocated roughly about 8.4 million is what we have as part of the grant, but these numbers will make change up and down as we get closer to the submission to the state. And these funds are required to be spent by September 30th, 2021. So their state is giving us their fiscal year to kind of spend the money. And they've actually talked about a carryover provision if needed. So that's kind of the background on the CARES Act. Any questions?
I have a question, but it's not really financial related either. I saw up top, towards the top of your list, that each.
Oh, Roxanne, we lost you.
Yeah, I think she was referring to the summer education. Since
Is
we,
that better? Yeah.
Yep. So now that
Okay.
we're teaching online for summer school this summer, that is eligible for the COVID-19 because our buildings we're allowed for that social distancing. We can charge that to the CARES Act.
Right. Do we also anticipate what we usually spend on E2020 summer classes to increase because of the situation we're currently in, or is that just not known at this time? Or any thoughts?
The credit recovery, I would assume it'd be a little larger in case some of those kids that had to recapture some of the credits that might not have done well, online.
Right.
We have reduced the fees this summer and are going to use the CARES Act to offset that, to help families out that might be struggling financially with the shutdown of the economy. So we have done that also as part of the CARES Act to offset some of their fees.
That was my next question. Okay. All right. Thank you.
And I think, can I just add too, that's where kind of we're ahead with our whole graduation intervention model when we're using those credit recovery, that we have this system in place, which has led to our high, graduation rates. But it really is important now when we're in this situation. And I've actually spoken to on a couple of committee meetings earlier last month with Dr. Rice when when I was on a committee about how do we get all our seniors to cross the line and graduate. So this is kind of an area where other districts do credit recovery, but we have that full-fledged intervention model
Right.
that's been very successful. So it's really coming in handy, and it's more challenging now, but at least we have the arsenal of the ability to provide those interventions.
One other thing that concerns me a little bit is students that have trouble with their credits because of the fact that we've done online. It will be difficult for them to be successful, I would think, in E2020 credit recovery because it's also online. And if that happens to be the problem with them, then I don't know how effective that's going to be in helping them.
I know that Ms. Peterson would, and the interventionists, they're pretty good at and the teachers of getting on top of those things. So it's still, let's just be honest, you're right. It is going to be more challenging, but at the same token, that's part of their model is reaching out, making the extra calls, doing what extra is necessary to ensure they get the support needed.
And I know they do an outstanding job because my son had to take some E2020 classes. So, and they're on top of it.
Yeah, but it is a legitimate concern in this environment, so I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm good.
Okay, the next one on the agenda is talking briefly about the enhancement funds. So as part of the enhancement funds, this spreadsheet kind of gives you a historical look of what we've kind of spent the enhancement funds on. And again, our primary process for that was our first year to help us with cash flow reserves. We took a lot of the money and just put it in the bank account for the first year. And the second year rolls along, we spend it. As the second year allocation comes in, we spend the year before. So we're kind of like in a rolling year of spending the money the year after collected. And that allowed us to push up our fund balance a little bit for our credit rating and for cash flow reserves. So we quit borrowing over the summer. And so looking at this, you can see that, we've done quite a few things with it, but most of it have been to support or enhance the program and not as much as replacing our general fund expenditures. Knowing that this was only a 6-year grant, that if the money went away, we didn't have to worry about reducing the general operating program that we were operating with. And we used a lot of it for big ticket items like the Dearborn High expansion, replacing our phone system for the E91 capability. And now that at the last board meeting, we also approved the replacement of the old CRTs for the emergency notification system with a new system that will start going in. They're actually going to start, I believe, in a couple of weeks of actually starting to work at some of the schools to start putting those information in. And at some point, I'd like to actually present a little presentation so the board has a better visual of what that program all entails. But some of the things on there, like offsetting the pay to participate fees, that the enhanced millage took that cost off the parents and as part of the millage. So you'll see a lot of things that benefit the programs, the students, the families, that were kind of the whole idea of it. However, with this current situation of dealing with a large shortfall, that we actually looked at trying to use some of the enhancement fund to offset operational purposes. And for the 2020-21 school year, we're looking at roughly about $2 million to offset general fund expenses. And we did that so we would not have to actually cut some more severely than the program that we're recommending for next year. And that money is available for 2 more years after this. And at that point, the money obviously will be no longer available for this enhancement fund millage. This November in 2020, the county did get support of enough of the school districts in Wayne County to put it on the ballot for a renewal. And so you will see that on the November election. But you'll just see the different things that we use this money for. Some of the things in there, we offer a student insurance program for those families that don't have insurance. We use it for a lot of our common areas. If you remember, we've used it for the renovation of some of the auditoriums for new sound systems, for cafeterias for the new sound systems. We've added a nurse position. We've added some counseling positions. And we also use it for class size adjustments. So as you're aware, every school year, we always have what we call hotspots where the actual enrollment in a particular grade might be higher because of some new enrollees. And we use this money to add that additional teacher so it's not impacting the general fund allocation and doesn't go up and down. It doesn't create a hardship on the general fund. We use the enhancement fund to work on those class sizes. And I think, as you've heard before, class sizes in Dearborn are very good. And obviously we use it for some technology replacements. We've used it for the attendance incentive. That actually is going to go away next year as one of our cost savings to utilize that funding for the general operating purposes. So I just kind of give you an idea of the overall. At the very beginning of the program, we replaced playgrounds. So some of the things that are very visual and we're helping the district improve our school program. So just kind of give you, so you can see that the CARES Act is going to help contribute to next year. The Enhancement Fund is going to contribute to next year. And so those things will kind of bring into the different scenarios as we go forward. One more visual graph I want to share. All right, so this graph shows you the history since 1996 of the salary rate increases, the retirement increases, and the foundation increases. The yellow line is the retirement increase, and that is something we don't control. This is for the pension system for school employees at the state level. This is a state-run program that is totally independent of our funding purposes, but the state has used some of the money for our school funding to help offset the increases in the MIPSERS program, which is our school pension system. You can see that continues to rise and is expected to rise for several more years. until we actually get to a point where it's been underfunded. So when the unfunded liability gets to a certain level, we'll start seeing that kind of come back down. But at this point, it's still going up quite significantly. And that always puts pressure on us every school year of covering that additional amount. The red line shows the salary increases. So you can see that back in 2009-10, when we had that 470 decrease, our salaries, also the employees gave back money to the district. You can see we're taking a dip and it kind of leveled out for many years and starting to rise again. And then our school funding is the blue line. And again, seeing the 2009-10 steep decrease. And then it was kind of recovering nicely, kind of following the red line, which is our salary line. And that was a negotiation strategy where we're kind of trying to follow our foundation. As our percentage on our foundation went up, we tried to mimic that in our negotiation process. Unfortunately, for the 2021 year, as you can see, with the most likely scenario of using that 650, you can see where our revenue source has dropped tremendously, but our expenditures were obviously already in place going forward, as we're in our second year of a 5-year contract going into our third year. And most of the contracts are settled for that 5 years with the exception of a couple, but obviously those costs are already built into our structure. So without approaching the unions, which HR is doing, I cannot, as a budget, I have to continue on with the expected expenditures as we develop a budget. So this is kind of just a visual presentation showing those three different streams of revenues or expenditures. All right, so now we're going to move on to the scenarios. I probably won't as much. Go ahead.
Quick question. Would you say we would have the same assumption about, I see that this one is only DFT, other unions as well, or you took the...
Yeah, most of the unions follow the same process. We usually use the DFT as the model because that's our largest bargaining group and our largest expenditure. And so usually, use them as the bargaining model as we go forward, as we look at other unions. So all these follow the same path, usually for the salary adjustment. There's always different economic issues with individual unions that we deal with, but the salaries we try to keep the same.
Okay.
All right, going on to the different scenarios now. And we'll start off with the most likely. So again, not much has obviously changed on the top end of the statement. Make it slightly bigger. And so looking at next year's projected program, our number of students has increased slightly. The Student Services Division modified their number of students, so we're looking at roughly increasing about 151 students for next year. The salary portions, as I stated earlier, are contracted obligations. So unless we come to a letter of agreement to modify that, those are set in place. The biggest change on here is the foundation increase. Previously, I was using a 450 number, and that number has raised because of the May revenue consensus that they found that there was a $650 shortfall in the current year for revenue. And that started off several things. So that obviously gave us a starting point for discussions for the budget at the state level. And it gave us the data that with the shortfall in the current year, the state has to have a balanced budget. So obviously they can't just let it ride and deal with it next year. The Treasury will notify, or the budget will notify the Treasury Department that there is going to be a shortfall. That's an official letter that has to go to the budget office or the Treasury's office. The Treasury will then have 30 days to give a notice to the legislature that if they do nothing, then 30 days after the legislator gets notified, if they don't have a supplemental state aid bill, they will have to prorate our current year funding for schools. And something similar is going to happen on the general fund side. So if the legislators don't do anything in that 30-day after they get the letter from the Department of Treasury, then that $650 will become automatically applied to our school aid funding for July and August, depending on when that 30 days happens. So as you're aware, that our funding comes from the state from October through August, even though our fiscal year is July through June. So obviously, we're going to be done with our program by June 30th, as required by state law. But our revenue, we still receive 2 of the 11 payments from state aid in July and August. So there's a real possibility that we will see a proration of our revenue well after our school year has finished. And at that point, obviously, there's not much we can do to impact it. And we only really have, in a normal school year, roughly about 2 weeks of school left before school ends. And really, at that point, it's very difficult to make any kind of monetary change in our program more than what we've already done at this point. So that $600 is a likelihood of impacting us this current year. Now, I didn't change the top of our screen too much, but just know that if the state does it this year in 2019-20, that's 650, the way the state works it, they don't have to do it again next year. They basically reset all the values this year. So if that happens, we're not going to get hit with $650 reduction twice. We're just going to hit with $650 at some point, either this year, which is the likelihood, unless the legislators actually take legislative action and give a state aid supplement bill. And it won't happen next year because everything stays at that level. It doesn't go back to the previous level. It'll stay at that level, and that's where school funding will go forward. So I just want to make sure you understand that that 650 is going to impact us most likely this year and not next year. But of course, obviously without knowing or reading minds, we don't know what the legislature is going to respond or not going forward.
Question for you, Tom.
Yes.
I have one as well. Go ahead,
Okay.
Jen.
Because this is thoroughly confusing when you're saying hit us this year, not next year. So we're dealing with 3 different calendars. Some people might be looking at a regular calendar, January 1 to December 31. We can't think that way. What we're saying is they might hit us with a decrease in the state calendar, but when it happens might be after we've already rolled into a new school calendar.
Correct.
And that's why we're showing that for this current year that ends at the end of this month, we'd have had a surplus of just over $1,067,000, and that we would be projecting next year to be down almost 2.3 million, right?
Correct.
Whereas if we were more on that state schedule, our surplus this year would be much smaller and our deficit next year would be much smaller also.
The 650 will either move above the line for this year, for looking at projections for next year, 2021. So that 650 might move up into the 1920. So basically, I would take that $30 million reduction and move it up. And instead of having $1 million surplus, I'm going to have a $12 million loss.
Right.
So it could go either way, and not knowing what the state's going to do. Regardless of what happens, unless they come up with some additional revenue source, which is unlikely at this stage of the game, we're going to take the hit in our budget in one of the 2 places. Now, at the end of 2021, either way, wherever that 650 hits, we're still looking at an operating deficit next year of roughly about 2.2 million under the most likely scenario. Does that make sense?
Hold on. So if the 650 hit in this year, we would have a deficit of 12.5. And if that happened, we would still have a deficit next year because we would then have taken that negative 13.5 million out of next year, which could make it look like we have one heck of a surplus next year.
Well, if you look at the very first line of the 2021, the operating surplus or deficit carries forward. So next year, if we took the 650 and put it above the line, for the use of a term to recognize it, so we'll end with a $12 million deficit. So going into this year, I'm going to have a $12 million deficit continue because my revenue has already been adjusted the year before. And then you'll see this year that we'll have roughly, a cost savings of roughly, let's say 10 million of cost savings for this year. And then you'll see that, well, at the end, we'll still have a $2 million deficit. So if you take that $13 million out, I'm actually operating at a surplus for next year, depending on when the
Right.
adjustment gets.
Right. So it really, timing could make things look a lot different here.
Yes.
It-
our fund balance
Depending
will
on the
look
timing,
like-
it could make it look like we had a $12 million deficit this year, which isn't necessarily the case. And it could make it look like we had a $10 million surplus next year. We're not that far off. It's just a question of when does one year end and one year begin.
Right.
And can
Right.
I add? Oh,
Go ahead,
Tom.
Glenn.
No, it's okay. Go ahead. Theo. Can I just add something too to the, like, you know, and Tom showed some of the, you know, we were chugging along in January before the crisis hit, and we were looking at potentially the governor ordering the greatest increase we were going to see in years. Then all of a sudden the COVID situation hit, it went south. Then you might recall we had to submit that continuity of learning plan. And remember, part of that order from the governor was that you weren't allowed to have any layoffs and you had to keep paying staff. So what all our associations are saying with this is, hey, wait a minute, that's not fair, because you said we would still get, you know, between this from the state, we were supposed to be funded. But as Tom said, then this triggers. So with the there's the deficit, but that was kind of our hands were tied. Not to say that we wanted to lay people off, but we were under that assumption. So all of our associations are actually advocating, first of all, to say, look, you guys need to fix this because this is what we were told. Secondly, I just want to add that we're also trying to really ramp it up for that federal stimulus money as well that states need, and that would hopefully help to save. Given that, though, I think what you're going to see from Tom's plan, we're very lucky to have Tom leading this, because we have a method where we're not in panic mode. We're in budget crisis at the state, but we have a good plan under Tom's, you know, leadership and what he's been doing to deliver. I also want to mention that some of you may have seen, or this is about a month ago, where the state superintendent, all the associations said, hey, this year you guys better put out 3 different budget plans. Guess what? That's how we've been operating for the last 5 years, with 3 so we have been ready to, so even though we're kind of in crisis, we still are calm about it because we know we're going to be able to deal with it. And we're confident in Tom's leadership and his role. So I just wanted to add that and just give Tom a little kudos. And then secondly, we appreciate the leadership of the board, because you've been intrinsically involved in all these committee meetings, and at every board meeting, you're very diligent about making sure that we are spending our finances appropriately. So that's where I think in Dearborn, we're ahead with this situation. We also, I'll just say, Tom, I'm kind of taking a little of your steam, but maybe changing it up. We're also very fortunate because of the Wayne County enhancement millage. Other districts that don't have that are going to have a tougher time riding out this without that millage. So that's just another factor that, if you see within Tom's plan, he's already mentioned. So those are some advantages that we have. The only problem with that one is that it's not indefinite, and it's going to be on the, it'll be on the county will be putting that on the ballot in November. So anyway, I just wanted to add that and give Tom a little kudos here. Thank you.
Most of my questions have been asked or already answered, but since you brought up the point about us being obligated to keep our positions filled, and I don't know if you could answer it, it's kind of hypothetical, but do you believe that the state may roll over the 650 for next year to kind of cover their butts in the scenario of, well, we asked you to cover or to keep the employees employed this year? Do you understand my question?
Yeah, I do. And Tom, you can add after I comment. I'm just going to say what I think is going to happen is you're going to have politics between the different branches of government.
Always.
I'm not getting partisan on any side, but we obviously know the legislator is one party and the executive is the other. So I'm not sure, because there's going to be some of that at play between the groups. And the other factor that it may be, though, is the fact that it's an election year, right? So that always puts a little extra pressure. So I do think there's going to be some politics. We're lucky that our local representatives are very supportive, Santana and Abdullah Hammoud and them of, education funding. So, but that's my analysis. And then Tom, you could add too. I mean, they probably, this could ride out, until the end of October, because even though we have to balance our budget like we did last year, if you remember, for another reason that went back and forth. So that potentially, do you see that, Tom? What is your opinion on that? Do you see that possibly?
Yeah. So what the economists are saying is the state, obviously, with this current shutdown, they delayed all income tax returns, deadline until June 30th. So they're talking, or I'm sorry, July 30th. So they're talking about delaying making any kind of formal recommendations as part of the school funding until after an August new revenue consensus. So normally it would only have two, once in July and once in May. They're talking about having a special one in August. So then they will have the income tax collections and the data, because that is a large portion of the state funding is the income tax portion. Now they take that and they send and start the process where the state budget will send a letter to the Treasury that, giving this Treasury 30 days to reply, and then the Treasury sends it to the legislator, they give them 30 days. Then you're talking October when they would have to do something, and then it's past the state's fiscal year, which then means that any kind of adjustment will happen in next year versus the current year. So there's different scenarios that could happen that could, by doing nothing, but when they start to do nothing, sets the timetables where next year could be the time where they have to react to it. If that makes any sense. So at this point, it's a guessing game of when to put that shortfall in your budget, either for the current year or for next year.
And we're talking about the 650, but they can always decrease it more than that.
Right. And so what I'm worried about, and that's where our three scenarios come into play, is it's worse than 650 because, again, the general fund is short also relatively the same amount of money as we know right now, that if the general fund is short and the school aid fund makes up 54% of the entire state budget, and there's serious concern that they could push some of the shortfall in the general fund into the school aid fund to help offset the programs that would get impacted in the general fund side. So there is a likelihood that 650 could be higher, but we know that 650 is what is in the school aid fund just by itself on a proration basis. So there's a lot of unknowns, and having that range is what we're working with, is kind of where we have to kind of, give our best guess. But we've amended the budget twice, once in the January, February timeframe, and once again at the end of the year. We might be in it 3 times next year, just because once we get an idea when that 650 hit, we're going to have to amend the budget to more reflect reality of what kind of program we're going to be working on.
But they would have to have something by the end of October before the election. Is that correct?
Correct. Now, we're required to adopt a budget by July 1st.
July 1st.
So we're going to have to adopt something, even if it's all estimates and wild guesses. I don't think it's wild guesses, but we're going to have to adopt by July 1st, even though by the time the fall comes along, it might not be reality.
Right. Educated guesses.
Don't get hung up about having the perfect budget, because you can't have it. Just understand that we have to adopt something, and we're going to have to amend it as many times as we need to get to where our current operating budget is at.
Okay.
Can I
I
ask
got a
something?
couple more questions.
Go ahead, Jess.
When we're looking at this scenario and it shows the 60 retirements, is this assuming the 60 retirements are happening at the end of the year that we are currently in? Or is this for next year? And then are we assuming that these positions are being filled or left vacant?
At this point, it looks at the 60 positions, it's being refilled, but at a lower salary amount. So 60 positions are still, these are retirements that will happen before the start of next school year.
Okay,
Salary payments for most of our unions, like our teacher union was the largest one, goes from September through, just last pay in August, all the way through the following August. So even though we ended June 30th, that depending if they pick the 21 pays a school year or 26 pays for the whole year, they spread out the money. So they're not getting paid any more money. It's just how much they get paid per pay for the year's worth of work. So when it
So
comes
are
to
we pretty
30th,
comfortable
we're
with the
still paying
60?
for that school year.
So are we pretty comfortable then with the 60 retirements since we're near the end of the year? I mean, are we on target for 60 people having retired?
That number was moving slow, but it is picking up. I think a lot of it will be determined by what our school program looks like next year. And some people will be happy about it, some will not. You're not going to appease everybody, but that'll have a big impact of what our school program is going to look like next year.
So I would just say too that when Jim to that question too, which is kind of what we had to do when we had the cuts. Remember when we had the lower, we didn't know what was going on with the state, and we had the lower enrollment the year before. Is that we were able to, for the most part, reduce positions without laying off for the most part. And that would, to your point, yeah. So as we look at our reductions, which we're going to have to reduce positions, you would not, people would theoretically not lose jobs through the attrition because you would move people around, so they would take the most essential jobs, but you wouldn't refill some of the positions where people left. Now that's not 100% rule though, because we know with our system we can't guarantee no layoffs and whatnot, which is what happened last year. But that would be another way of saving positions and protecting class sizes. Maybe people move out of positions that were more what we call support first into possibly classroom positions. It's the same thing that happened last year. So that was a good point. I appreciate you bringing that up. Trustee Thorpe. And then secondly, I just wanted to add this, and Roxanne, you talked about the election year. So here's where the federal too, right, is important because, the federal stimulus back when we had in 2008, we received money to help us ride out that tough economic time. And so the question would be, it's not just Michigan, because you probably heard it on the news. Other governors have said at some point they won't have enough money to pay police, fire, and all the things that come out of the general fund. And the constitutions may be different than in Michigan, but a lot of the states are in the same situation. And so hopefully, with the federal election coming up too, there'll be enough, people will kind of understand that there really is a need to do something to help the states out, because otherwise you're cutting these essential services and schools. Mm-hmm. And in Michigan, it may be this transferring of money. And so hopefully that will occur. I think the more positive thing this time around versus last time is, and Tom, you can speak to this, is that as long as we get out of the crisis, we rode out several years of economic downturn. And so we were cutting, even beyond. And then we also had, some tax cuts that were made by the administration at the time, the governor. And so then we didn't have the funding to fill that gap. We think that if we were to get stimulus this time, the cuts would continue. They would get us out of this 2-year, assuming we get out of the COVID crisis. So we have a better economic outlook than we did back then when, the automotive tanked and whatnot. But at the time, that was under 2 different administrations. That stimulus bill started under the Bush administration, and then the Obama administration actually picked up, implemented it. Tom, I don't know if you want to add anything to that or.
Yeah, most of the economists, as we've been listening to all the webinars, is that if the state reopened in late May or early June, then most of them have seen by 21, 22 that we would be back to, if not close to, where we're operating prior to the shutdown. That's in most of the categories. There might be a few that are lagging, but in most of the categories. And we did move to the improving phase. The governor did open up a lot more of the economy just today, was I think by Monday or something like that. So on timetable, for what most of the economists have said, that we're going to have a revenue shortfall for at least 2 years. And that's where we have to look at. We're trying to make sure, how can we adjust our program without severely taking the deep cuts for a couple of years, because it's hard to get those years back for those students. So we don't want to do that and have more of a, all right, we're going to have to take a cut just for operational purposes, but using the one-time money of the enhancement, the one-time money of the CARES Act, using our fund balance to kind of smooth that so we don't have to take severe of a cut, but having a consistent program so the kids and the students and the families in our district have a good educational program going forward. And that was kind of like a conversation with the curriculum. You know, this curriculum adoption has been in planning for 2 years, and we were lucky enough to get the CARES Act to put that in place so we can continue to improve the instruction for our students versus delaying it and having to still struggle with our old one we know which has shortcomings. So that's kind of the idea of using that one-time fund money. And if we get more federal funding to help off some of these costs, then we could take some of those reductions in personnel and bring them back and continue to have the program improve year after year. I don't know if I answered your question or not, Glenn.
Yeah, no, you did. Thank you. You helped expand.
Okay.
And we want your expertise, so.
All right, so just keep moving along. So the next graph, oh, I'm all messed up now. Let me go back this.
Your tabs are like mine now.
I got too many up, so I can't read them when I go over them.
That's what with the double screen, I'm looking above, I've got all these tabs.
Yep, so on the best case model, a little larger surplus, a little more students coming in, and only a 500 student decrease. We're actually pretty break even at a slight, 172,000, which is nothing in our size budget. So on the best case scenario, we really don't have to impact the program as much, still making some reductions in staff, but not really impacting the overall program on the financial side. And in the worst case scenario, actually, depending on how the program finishes, that we actually end up a little bit in the hole, have less kids coming in, but $1,000 deductible out of our deductible, our decrease in our foundational allowance, looking at roughly about an $8.8 million deficit. So that's the kind of the two ranges. And underneath that scenario, we would actually reduce more additional staff than what we did on the most likely scenario. And we'll kind of get into that a little more of a detail, but just kind of showing the range of what we're looking at and trying to accommodate how far do we have to go to kind of have a program that we think will work well for next year based on our funding. All right, so adjustments is the one I want next. So not much has changed on this screen. This kind of shows you the different levels. I did not change the top part. I forgot to change the top part for the 1,000 and 650, but the student counts is what I really want to focus on. So underneath that scenario, we'd be looking at 20,785 students for next year in the most likely scenario compared to our 20,634. So here's our current counts up on the top right-hand side. And these are the projected for most likely for next year. And for a best case, we'd be at 20,830. And our worst case at 20,650. So which is kind of just slightly above where we're at currently for our current student count. And we do that to kind of give us a range that depending on where the students come in at for next year, that gives us an idea of what our funding costs. And our wage cycle, our wage costs are down here based on our bargaining agreements. And again, using a BA step 7 as our base, which is 5 steps up, as an average of where new staff comes in, because obviously depending on the staff credentials and the difficulty of the finding a position in a certain field with certain credentials, that they don't always start at the lowest step, they'll start somewhere higher, make sure we can attract those teachers to our district. So that's how we calculate the difference on the number of retirements. So looking at a teacher at the top step, teacher at a lower step, and that's where that savings come in to help offset the steps that are in our contract. All right, looking at the budget matrix, you'll see on the top here is, I'll make it a little bigger. Get bigger.
Thank you.
So you on the top here is where our staffing adjustments. So under the best case scenario, we're looking at reducing 54 positions. Worst case scenario, reducing 86 positions. And the most likely scenario, looking at 67 positions. And so there's another sheet that we don't share in a public forum. So until it gets finalized, we have notified staff that may be adjusted. So when you looked at the most likely scenario, and we had 60 reductions in staff, and this is where we look at out of those 60 reductions that we wouldn't necessarily replace those or reassign staff, but then you would have roughly about 7 positions in this one that we would actually go further, that we would not either have to lay off positions, which most likely we wouldn't have to lay off on that because that number could be open positions. A good example of that, our director of capital projects, since the infrastructure program was not successful in November, that position has now been vacated and we're not filling that position. So it's kind of a freeze on that position. So that's where that 7 positions might be just open positions that we're not filing or filling right now. Same thing with custodial positions. If there's open custodial positions, those kind of positions we're holding on to and not filling them until we know what our educational program is next year. And as we know what those programs are, then we'll start filling in those open positions. So there could be a part-year position that we're not filling until we get a better idea. Those kind of scenarios are all built into our staffing levels for next year. And then we have other things. This last school year, we gave them additional $10 per pupil for equipment and supplies. So that's obviously fallen back off. So that's a cost savings to our budget. Buses, we're looking at reducing buses from 4 buses down to 2 buses. So there's a slight adjustment there. Our capital improvement program, this 2,500 right here. We were at 3,500 because we knew we had a surplus last year or this current year of 2 million before this all hit. That we knew we were going to put some additional money in the building and site fund to help our infrastructure since we didn't have any kind of outside funding coming as through that November election. But knowing that we're going to have to roll that back because we can't continue at that level down to $1 million for infrastructure from the general fund. There is money coming from the enhancement fund also to help capital improvements. But for the general fund portion, we're looking at saving $2.5 million for that. Our MIPSERS adjustments will get adjusted slightly of roughly about $1.2 million. And that's always based on the prior year payroll. So looking at our 2 years ago payroll to our last year's payroll, that we know that some of the funding is based on our last year payroll. So we'll get some additional MIPSERS funding from that. Assuming the legislators don't do something and modify that number, if they're based on the current formulas, we know we'll get some additional money. So the numbers down here, the numbers down here get adjusted and carried forward to our previous scenarios as for the adjustments for other parts of the budget, which a large portion of that is staffing. So looking
Tom, can I add that just something on the staffing? So we made that call about a month ago, and so to delay hiring. So we're we have savings by putting a halt on pretty much all hiring other than maybe special ed for the fall because we haven't had to fill positions. And I know, Tom, you have even another position, let's just say that was coming off the book, so that we actually had a meeting with HR and with the operations, and we came up with a plan, and the same with the executives, so that we were not filling anything right away. I mean, it didn't make sense for us to, we couldn't have full capacity in the buildings anyway under the governor's order not to fill it. And so that's going to allow us to have some savings as well. And so that's why we kind of made some of those different decisions. The other thing I want to mention too is that, we got good input from the ADSA, from the, from all the union groups. We've been talking to them all along, several, meetings to discuss the budget and other things. So, and that's kind of how we always have operated. So.
Tom, I have another question.
Yes.
So when you were saying that with the transfer to the building and site fund, we went from 3.5 million down to 1 million. Well, you can say that in this budget, it's a savings of 2.5 million. What we're also then saying is that we're moving less money over to care for our buildings, and we're probably having to defer some maintenance from next year to some point down the road. which is a similar situation what we did several years ago to try to minimize the staffing changes, correct?
Correct. Back in 2009-10, yes.
Yeah. So we're not saving this money. We're just not putting it towards the buildings to try to keep our budget balanced.
Correct.
Thanks.
Yeah, the whole infrastructure discussion is something that we can table for a while, but it's not going to go away, and it's just going to get worse as we kind of do just more deferred maintenance type scenarios. So that's something that we are going to have to address going forward.
Can I make another point too? So we're talking about all these cuts potentially. We have our model to the point prior to the crisis where things have been going extremely well in the district. And so one thing that I would like to just state is that once we get out of the crisis, we're cutting things that are supports to students or the program, or Jim, your example of the building operations. So at some point we've got to restore that, and to your point of operations and building maintenance. But at some point, what I would tell you is we also want to restore these positions that have been affected, and I'm not going to mention which ones in general, but just position, because I don't want anyone to think, well, we're this specific until people are notified. But, for me to remind you guys, once we get out of the crisis, that, hey, remember all these positions we cut, and we've got to restore those services to our students. So just keep that in your back of your mind, because we're cutting. And remember, we did the cuts last year too, to balance. So at some point, something will give, or then the students start, not getting the services they need. So I just want to put that out there as well, so that when we're doing what we need to do now to tighten the, both on the operation side, as Trustee Thorpe mentioned, and then for me on the staffing, instructional side as well.
All right, going back to our agenda, there's a couple of long-term views I want to share now. So the first one, I want to look at long-term view. Let's see. I'll make it a little bigger, but I'll have to roll the screen a little bit. So looking at a long-term view, this is looking at if the current year is impacted by the most likely scenario of 13,500,000 and change. If it gets impacted in the current year, and we have that $1 million savings we're estimating on the operational side, that we're going to have a deficit this year of $12 million. So that $12 million will reduce our fund balance down to $21 million, which is roughly a 9.61% fund balance. So that's pretty low, just because obviously we can't impact it a lot. When we look at next year, that we would actually have an operational savings of making adjustments using additional money that comes in for the sinking fund, and using roughly at least half of the CARES Act for offsetting current year expenses. That's where the reduction in the building and site fund. So those kind of adjustments that we're adjusting the budget and get it back into a loss of only 3.2 million. And that would add to our fund balance, we back up to 14.09. So that's looking at it if it affected this current year, and then next year it gets to 14.09%. And then obviously the following year, we look at reducing our adjustments again for our building and site and relying just on the enhancement fund. The CARES Act would obviously go away, so we have to add that money back into our budget from where we reduced. And looking at state aid of roughly 40% of the state aid coming back to us through the economy. Third year out, 40% comes in. Second year or third year out, the remaining 20% comes in. And looking at our adjustments for the money for the enhancement fund, obviously that money is no longer available unless the election is successful this coming November. And we could, and potentially do something, but that money would actually be not available. That looking long term, we'd be still a deficit in 2022-3 of roughly $1 million, but by 23-24, we'd be back positive and having a balanced budget for the last 2 years. So this is a 5-year lookout that it would take us roughly about 3 years that would be in deficit situation. And then by years 4 and 5, we'd be actually more of a break-even budget. And our fund balance would drop from roughly 15% down to about 12%. And that is right at the cusp of where we have to start worrying about cash flows when we're at the 12% level. Now, unfortunately, underneath this scenario, that the money from the general fund for infrastructure is basically gone. So obviously we could not necessarily live at that. So there would have to be some kind of plan put in place somewhere around the 2-3 year mark to actually have money set aside for infrastructure. But this is just a scenario showing one that did not address it, but kind of looking at a 5-year plan of when we would actually be impacted.
So if I can add to that, then obviously we've talked about the enhancement budget helping us, but if you might recall in 2014, we had that fund balance was below 5%. So the fact that we built it up, because I know when I was hired by the board, that was one of the tasks that I was given, and I think I hired Tom and said, we've got to build that back. So the moves that we've made over the past 5 years are helping us ride out this time. And again, the fund balance at the time was like that for specific reasons. And I know Trustee McDonald, you were on the board at that time, but it was done because we were in a real tough economic time. But if we had that kind of fund balance, we'd be in greater trouble right now. So I'm glad that, under the direction of the board and the leadership that we've implemented, and that's why when we tell everyone, including our employee groups in the community, why do we want to build that fund balance? This is exactly why, this kind of situation. And then we don't have that kind of borrow. And you might remember too, we used to have to borrow and we had interest every summer. So we have not had to borrow money for 5 years.
And it gave me a pit in the stomach every time we had to do it.
Yeah.
And I have to say that your whole team, and Tom especially, you've done a great job doing that, as it was difficult and it was something that we definitely wanted to see happen. So I thank you for making it happen for us.
Thank you.
All right, looking at another scenario. All right, so this is looking at a worst case scenario. Let's say that 20 million is where we're going to lose on our revenue through the worst case scenario. The enhancement money, the 2 million in orange, stays the same. The CARES Act stays the same. The infrastructure infrastructure reductions stay the same. And still looking at a 20% revenue reduction, our 40% recovery, 40% recovery, and a 20% recovery. Looking at the additional changes we had in the program for the worst case scenario, you'll see that our fund balance actually drops down to 6.37%, 11.75 when we make all the adjustments for next year. But with the state aid coming back slowly, that it takes year to year 4 before we'd actually level out, and we'll end up roughly about a 9.92 to 10% fund balance on a worst case scenario.
And in that case, in all those years, we would have to most likely do some summertime borrowing.
Correct. Now, obviously,
going out how far, do you know? Who knows?
Well, the 3%, you're talking maybe anywhere from 8 to 10 million, depending on the timing, just because we struggle because the state gives us 2 of our state aid payments after June 30th, after we've already closed the year.
Right.
So that May through August time is really tough. It always depends when the tax collections for the subsequent years start coming in at the end of July. All depends on when the cash flow happens. And so that's always really a struggle for us. So we typically not just do a standard borrowing, we do a line of credit.
Right.
Allows us to just draw upon it when we need it. So we try to reduce the interest costs we're paying on that borrowing. But just kind of show you on the worst case scenario where we're going to lose roughly about 3% of our fund balance if we don't make additional cuts than what we proposed in our plan from the three type of scenarios from best case, worst case, most likely.
And it could take us more than 6 years to get it back.
And that's where this is assuming the state, because it's always unfortunately a political process at the state level on our school funding. That's assuming they're going to get us back to full over that 3-year period. You know, it
That's a
might
big
be
assumption.
Yes, well, you got to have assumptions. These
Right,
things, but
exactly.
it might be a much slower process, and that would actually prolong our recovery if we don't make additional cuts. So if it comes to the worst case scenario, we might have to actually do more adjustments than what we've planned on underneath our worst case scenario, if that's the case. Because obviously that's going to impact our is going forward too, that's something we'll have to deal with the staffing. Because remember, our staffing in Dearborn, 85% of our general fund budget is salary and benefits. So we have to always take that into effect that if we want to make any significant change in our budget, it's going to have to affect staffing. And underneath this scenario too, there's no money for infrastructure after the enhancement millage runs out of money.
At what point in the fund balance do we have to borrow? You mentioned borrow.
Usually it's, we roughly look around the 12% range, the 11 to 12% where we have to start looking at possibly borrowing.
And the state's minimum is around 6%.
5%.
5%.
Yep. And so this current situation is going to impact a lot of districts in dealing with that, especially if they do that reduction in the current year versus next year.
So one of the things that we're doing with the associations, but also, you know, I'm on that state committee, is we are talking about the need, the important need for flexibility in policies. So this would be an example of one policy, maybe in a crisis that you don't want to send necessarily, you know, a district that may not be in as good of a situation as we are with our fund balance. They may need to go below it. So you don't want to cripple them by kind of going after them in this crisis. So that's just one example. There are multiple policies with student attendance and all sorts of things that our groups are in our committee is looking at right now. And I will say that was one reason why when the governor did close school, that from an educational community, when she put in so many provisions that we were exempted, it really helped us out as superintendents and school district boards of education, because we didn't have to comply with a lot of things that we otherwise would have to comply. There's a lot of compliance things that are required in the Michigan Department of Education. They don't create them, but they enforce them. And so that's one of the things I'm saying on that state committee, is that we will likely need to ask for, and I've heard Dr. Rice say, you know, some policy flexibility, but all the associations are pretty much unanimous in the fact that we need some flexibility in policies. And again, that's what kind of the governor's order did at the time, given the crisis.
Okay, so that.
Can I ask you a question on that one though? That you equated that the enhancement village was there for that time and then it expired. Is that how you had that?
Correct. Because obviously we don't know if the November election will be successful at the time. We do know that if it is successful, we'll get about $1 million less money, because charter schools are now included in that per student calculation of that funds coming back to the districts.
But we're
If
still
it's not successful in November, chances are they'll go for it again, I'm assuming.
Yes, and obviously we're going to have to address our infrastructure at some point also.
Right.
Well, that's why they're doing it now, even though it expires a couple months out, or a couple years out, excuse me, is because they are under the rule. They have to do it only during a general election is what the county can do it. So by doing it now in November, 2 years before it expires, they could go again for it in 2 years.
Yeah.
But they can only do it in that 2-year cycle by law.
All right, so next section, so that's it for the financial side. Now, obviously, the next steps on the financial side is we're going to have a public hearing on the budget at the June 8th meeting as part of the discussion agenda item on the board. And that's where the public will also have the ability to comment on the budget. And then obviously the formal adoption would be 2 weeks later at our second meeting in June, on the 22nd. So that's the next steps in our process. And again, I just want to caution, a lot of this is based on estimates. Still things could change. Obviously the discussions with the unions could change this going forward, or it may be status quo. It all will depend on what the state does, obviously, at the state level. If there's additional federal funding, that could change our program. So there's still a lot of what ifs going along, but we still have to meet the criteria of the law, making sure we have a budget adopted by July. Okay. All right, moving on to the next one. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to close some of these screens, so I can read them better. All right, so Moody's, as part of the process for the college, whenever a municipality issues a bond, there's going to be, has to get a new credit opinion. And the college, there's only a couple of them out there. Standard & Poor's is a primary one, it's the other one. And so on that, they do a credit update on ours, and we received an A1 credit. If you looked at our board briefs, if you look at school districts are usually triple B, and so A1 is the next step above that. So overall, we have a very good credit profile for standard Michigan school districts for an A1. And obviously you have 1, 2s, and 3s. So A3 is the lower and it goes to 1. Then it goes to AA at the next level. And you have small letters and big letters, but just know that A1 is above average grade level for school districts. And as part of that process, it's usually a 2 to 3 hour phone call going through all of the financial implications of a district. How are we organized? How are we doing financially? And part of that is our fund balance and how our fund balance looks at, compared to other school districts and to what they figure is a healthy operating school district. So it looks at trends, looks at past profiles. It looks at how your operating revenue and expenses have done over years. So it's quite of an extensive process. So there's a lot of information in this credit opinion about our school district, which is made up of both the college and the K-12 side. And it gets into a lot of detail. And if you look further down on the page.
I have a question.
Yes.
Well, you're kind of heading that way. I read this and it was rather interesting to me, but the institutional framework, we were kind of, I think, dinged for that. I don't know if that's the appropriate way to look at it. But is that because we have the college also?
No, it's more of the institutional framework is dealing with how schools in Michigan are funded.
Okay, I gotcha.
We're funded by the state, so we don't have a lot of control on that. And our MIPSers obligations is a big aspect of that too.
Okay.
You see the trend of that MIPSers going up so higher than our salaries and our revenue. So that means that's an institutional cost that we're going to pay and we have no control over it.
So okay, so that would be the same case scenario for all the districts in the state. Right. Okay.
And if you look here, the BAA, that's your standard framework where districts are at. So anytime you see an A or a AA or a AAA, that just keeps going better of where you're at on the financial comparability to the standard BAA. So that kind of looking at that. So you can see our fund balance, we're at a AA because we had a fund balance at a reasonable, if someone was at 5%, you could be at a BA or even lower from where you are compared to other school districts. So just looking down here, you can see a lot of A's that are above that. AA is even better. So I wanted to share that with you so you can see some of the different things that were going in our district because we've been so healthy that our ratings for bonds and when we go out for borrowing looks favorably upon the district. When you look at our operating history, that for us having an AA rating for our operational history, that means our 5-year average, we've done a long way from where the district was 5 years ago to today. Remember, we were at the 5% mark on our fund balance back then. We've done a lot of improvement to the district to make it a more healthy organization, to be able to handle these things. And one of the things that was important, one of the things they really focused on is what have we done about COVID-19 in Michigan? Because, they wanted to know how we're responding to it, what our projections look like, how strong is the management team addressing these issues and dealing with these issues. So that was important, and they did not write us down. Remember, we were A1 prior to, last year, and so us keeping an A1 rating shows well that we're healthy in the district.
So I would assume that we got the same report when we went out for the bond last year. Similar report.
Yes, so I didn't actually get into these levels, but just knowing that, that they felt strongly that the district, even if it gets hit by this proration, because we have to be very forthcoming with them on our data, that they knew I was using the models you were looking at today, was showing them this is, even though we're going to get reduced by $650, and that's a big hit to the district, by looking at our plan of how we're looking at recovering in 2 to 3 years and showing them how we're doing that, how we're actually planning, how we look at 3 different models, best case, worst case, most likely. They felt that the management team has a handle on it because they know we can't control it, or we're going to react accordingly to it and keep our district healthy. So I think that just reflects on our operational history of how we've ran the district and how the college has done their side over the last several years. And Mr. Higgins, if you're out there, you're up next. So if you want to sign in, we'll get you your last section of the agenda. He's listening online, so he's going to call in shortly.
Well, we're waiting for him to call in. As I was reading this, I looked everywhere for a key for the AA, the BB, and I did not see one.
If you look at board briefs last week, you'll see that I had a key in there.
Okay, I didn't see it. I'll have to double check.
It's a
Okay,
link
great.
I have in there. Yep.
All right,
Overall,
thanks.
it's pretty good ratings.
Yeah, I knew it was pretty good, but
Yeah.
they couldn't make it more confusing.
Yeah,
Well,
but it's a
Moody's-
standardization, so yeah.
It's different than Fitch's. Each credit rating agency does it a little bit different.
Okay. And do we kind of have the same standings with Standard & Poor's and the others?
They only do the checkups once a year.
Okay.
Usually a much short call, but when you actually issue bonds to the market, they go much more in depth. So Moody's is going to have the most up-to-date information because of the recent process the college is going through. And whenever the college goes through a bonding or the K-12, we're one entity, so both get drawn into the process and spend the time on this.
Okay.
All right, I just want to quickly just cover that with you. So there's a lot of data in here. If it's interesting reading, it just talks about the whole aspect of our district and the college. So some good reading that it's important for the board at least be aware of. All right, and then the last section is the pre-audit conference, and I'm going to stop presenting at this point. And I don't know if Mr. Higgins, are you on yet?
He's on, but he's muted. Jeff, you're muted. If you're on the Google, go to the middle of the screen to unmute. A bar at the bottom will pop up. I think you're unmuted now.
It might be his mic.
Oh.
We don't hear you, Jeff.
How about that?
Oh, there you go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay, I just had to switch my my speaker system there, so I apologize for my technical ineptitude. I'm getting better in our remote environment, but still have a ways to go, I think.
We all are by necessity, right?
So anyway, I know it's been a long meeting for you guys. I do appreciate a couple minutes here at the end of the meeting as we are kicking off the audit. So on top of everything else that the business department is dealing with, we have our year-end audit for June 30th, 2020 coming up. So as part of that process, it is important for us to have just an open dialogue with the members of the board. It's important that if you have any questions, concerns, want to know how things are going, that there is open communication between us. So in that light, there's just a couple of things we like to start off with at the beginning of the audit process. And just as Tom mentioned at the beginning, so we are beginning our preliminary testing here in the very near future. And then we'll be out again in late August to do our year-end audit procedures. So we are performing a financial statement audit. As you're probably aware, we show up at the end of the process and present to the board the results of the financials for the year end. Now, as part of that audit, we do gain an understanding of the district's key internal control processes. And that is part of our audit process, but we're not expressing an opinion on the internal controls. But if we do come across any significant deficiencies, material weaknesses, those types of things, we do communicate those to the board. But again, it's important to keep in mind we're doing a financial statement audit, not an internal controls audit per se. Then the other important thing to keep in mind as we're going through the audit is that there is the concept of what's called materiality that's inherent in our work. That essentially means that we're placing a greater emphasis on those items that are more susceptible to be incorrect or have more significance to the financials, and place less emphasis on those items which there's a much lower risk of there being an error. Obviously, we're not looking at every single transaction. We have to focus our time in those areas that are of higher risk and of more importance to the financial statements and the users of the financial statements. Then the final piece, like I started off with, is just making sure there is a communication with the board. I think there is a letter that might be part of your packages, so my contact information is in there. But again, if there are any matters that you feel warrant particular attention, anything you feel we should be aware of as we're beginning our audit process, certainly you're free to mention that now, or if anything comes to mind later on, since I'm essentially putting everybody on the spot and asking this question. Again, it is a relatively long process as we're starting now and going through at least the end of August. I just want to emphasize, don't ever hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or comments or concerns about anything. So with that, I'll just open it up and see if there are any initial reactions or comments or any issues you feel are of particular emphasis as we're getting started.
I'm assuming you have not met with the audit committee as yet.
Not for this year's audit. So we do meet with the audit committee typically, at the beginning of the audit, and then we present to the board. But yeah, we have not met with the audit committee at this point.
Okay. And when you do, you're going to give them the same information that you just gave us.
Well,
and then some.
Yeah, so my understanding, so typically we present to the finance committee. So we don't have a separate meeting typically with if there is a separate audit committee, we particularly meet with the finance committee, but this letter then is dispersed to the board as a whole also. So they do get the same information in this letter. It's just important for us to have a virtual face-to-face conversation with a few members of the board, like I said, really to kickstart that communication with the folks who are essentially given the subcommittee task of overseeing the finances of the district.
Okay, I'm good.
Well, very good. If there's any other questions or comments from anybody?
We may be calling you as individuals.
Yes, well, certainly feel free. And I think my phone number is in the letter. Email is, if you prefer, we can certainly make sure we get my email address distributed to the group also. That might be, if that's preferable, whatever works for you guys, is certainly fine with me.
One more thing. I love your Eiserman jersey.
Oh, thank you. Yes, that was I won that at a raffle. So that's one of my prized possessions.
I bet.
Now, if you could just restore them to their past glory, then it'll be even that much more meaningful.
All right. Thank you, Jeff.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff.
A little bit, but so I would suggest our next finance committee meeting being in August, probably after they have their revenue consensus meeting, so we can kind of update of the whole finances and we think we're going. So I recommend a date sometime late August.
Agreed.
should we tentatively just say before the August board meeting, pending what the situation is, and assuming we're allowed to, get together live? I believe we will by that time. So
Before the
don't know when
August
they're gonna-
meeting or the September meeting?
It would be before the September meeting then, because it would be
the September.
August, which is probably mid-month, probably.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Yep. Okay. Any other comments or questions before we wrap up?
Is this I know it's condensed, but you're going to give the same kind of information at the board meeting next time, correct?
Probably not as long.
Okay, right.
Because since this is taped, I'm not going to go through it all in the level of detail, but a shorter presentation, usually about 10, 15 minutes to kind of give an overview of the program. Yes.
Right. I'm just wondering when I do a committee call out, or you will have covered basically all the information. Is there anything that I need to?
No, probably just dealing with the Moody's report, if you want to talk about that, and
Okay.
Mr. Higgins just talked about.
Okay.
And Trustee McDonald, I think that's how it's been done in the past too, when the committee chair just says, "Oh, Mr. Wall just presented all my reports." So
Exactly.
yeah, gives a little break, right? But there's other committees.
I appreciate it.
All right, so I think that's a wrap then. Everybody.
Yeah, can I just say something too? That I appreciate, the support and leadership of the board and the finance committee. And I've mentioned Mr. Wall, but I just want to let you know my team has spent hours on hours deliberating the budget and how to come up with the 3 plans. Obviously, it's led by Mr. Wall, but I just want to let you know the entire team, to the union heads, to the building principals, to especially the executive cabinet. We have honestly had hours and hours, and I know the board gets the updates in their report, but I'm telling you, we've been living, dreaming, and sleeping the budget. And sometimes I wake up, and then even this weekend, I was talking to Mr. Wall over the weekend because it just, it weighs heavy on us, and we want to make sure we're doing a good job to get ourselves out of this crisis and to make the right decisions for our students and our community. So I want to thank the support of the board, but I also give a kudos to my entire team. And we have a very trusting environment in which people will express their opinions, and then we come to a consensus to make these different recommendations that ultimately come to the board. So, and I can see Tom nodding his head too. Tom's had many, many more hours, but the whole team has put in a lot of time. And so,
Well, I want, for one, certainly appreciate the work that you do. And when you present the information, you make a lot of very complicated information easily understandable. So thank you.
And if you have any questions at any time, always free. I live this stuff so daily. So give a call, and hopefully I can even clarify a bit more for you.
All right. Thanks, Tom.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Have a good night.
Have a good evening.
And thanks to Eric and David and the
Absolutely.
crew for helping us every time we need these live virtual meetings, right?
The team behind the scenes.
Yeah, they work very hard. I get him stuff over the weekend for my 1-minute messages, or I was taping all the senior honors things, and he's just working like crazy. And Jacob, and then David's whole department with Katie and Sherry, they've been working extra time, so appreciate them.
Absolutely. Everyone, have a good night.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.